Yeah, welcome. So I'm going to give, I've got about 15 slides. So, it might take 15 to 20 minutes. Just going to give a general overview of strength and conditioning for endurance performers. So Andy, if you can click to the next slide, I think it says the aims of this presentation, what we're going to go through exactly. Yeah, can you click, Andy? Perfect. All right. So first of all, we've got to discuss what is strength and conditioning for endurance performers. For me, for endurance athletes, can you just skip back, Andy? Sorry, or is it on an automatic?
No, I can.
Yeah, just on that first aims section. Don't worry, guys. We'll get it. Can you just go back one, Andy?
That one.
The aims.
There's the aims. Yep.
Oh, I'm not seeing that on my slide. I'll continue in case it's loading. So basically, we're going to talk about what is. Here we go. Yeah, what is strength and conditioning for endurance performers? So it looks quite slightly different to what it would look for team sports, in my opinion. In team sports, strength and conditioning is everything fitness related, whereas S&C in endurance sports has a slightly different setup. So we're going to discuss some of the methods that we use, some strength and conditioning activities that we use with endurance athletes, and I'm also going to discuss like the rationale behind some of the practices we use. I'll give a general overview of my philosophy. I've got quite a simple mind in how I categorize things, and I hope that helps people implement that into their own programs. And then I'm just going to give some general recommendations, what we do with our athletes and what maybe you guys as coaches or athletes can use yourself. And like Andy said, some questions at the end. Brilliant. So Andy, if you want to take it to the next slide now, please. I think we've got a little time delay on this, perhaps.
Yeah, I've got it on my screen. It's on its way.
On its way. So strength and conditioning for endurance athletes, distance athletes, for me is all non-running activities that an athlete does to prepare themselves for their event or to improve their performance. So on that slide, we can see there is, several different methods that we may use. You can ask yourself, do I, with my athletes or myself as an athlete, which of these do I use? You may use some, you may not use them all, but we're going to discuss the merits of each. Okay, so if you can click to the next slide, Andy. Cool. So this is my strength and conditioning for distance runners performance model. So I'm not sure if you can quite see the full slide. I can't see the top green box, but I see strength and conditioning as two main things really. We've got one side of it, we've got injury risk management. Okay, so we never really say injury prevention because you never know if you've prevented an injury. So injury risk management is what I kind of focus it upon. The other kind of main benefit to S&C, then I'm not sure you can see this bit, but is performance enhancement. So that's the sexiest stuff. That's the stuff that we're kind of more interested in. But if we move down this this model, you can see the coach's key performance indicators, little line across there. So as a coach, I am an assistant or support staff to their athletes. So a coach wants from me, he wants a robust athlete. So basically, I look at it this way: a robust athlete is someone who has great tolerance to stress, so I can make them all robust by improving their tolerance to, say, repeated stress. So that means I can make them stronger, I can make tissue stronger, bone, ligament, tendon, muscle, or I can slowly improve their tolerance to stress by working with the running coach and slowly and methodically increasing their training load, say their mileage or their total volume above certain speeds and things like that, because we know that that is an injury risk as well. So the other side of things, the other way to prevent injuries or reduce injuries is just simply to reduce the stress on the tissue or the system. Yeah. So two simple ways to reduce injury risk: improve tolerance to stress, get stronger, or reduce the amount of stress you're placing on yourself or the athlete or the tissue. Yeah. So we can reduce stress by, perhaps changing muscle architecture, as you can see on there, or tendon architecture if it's tendinous issues that we have, make a stronger tendon, things like that. We can do other things by making them a bit more stable, which may affect their running mechanics. We can improve their range of motion, perhaps, which again may improve their running mechanics and reduce the stress that they're placing on certain tissues. So, if they're really tight in the hips, they may be planting their foot in a certain way, and that might increase the stress on certain tissues in the foot, ankle, or further up the chain. So that's a little bit of an overview of the injury risk management side of S&C. If you look below, I've got a little row that says tests. So these are some of the tests that we use, and the row below is exercise groups that we use to hopefully improve those tests and then improve those qualities and reduce the risk of injury. The other side, the cool side of S&C, is the performance enhancing side. So there's lots of literature now suggesting that strength and power training, in particular plyometrics, can improve running performance irrelevant of changes in other physiological markers such as VO2 max, lactate threshold, and things like that. So a coach wants, from an S&C coach, he wants a bit of help. Can you give my athlete better economy? A running coach can improve their athlete's economy through various physiological kind of adaptations, utilizing things like altitude training, just training volume in general and things like that. But there's certain things in strength and conditioning that we can do to improve a runner's economy. Okay, so an economy is basically the oxygen cost of a submaximal running speed. So through some strength and conditioning practices, strength training, power training, plyometrics, we can, it's been shown quite a lot in quite a lot of research now, we can reduce the oxygen cost at a certain speed. Basically, we get better springs, we can travel at a quicker speed, but using less or the same oxygen. Okay, so yeah, so that table there is something that maybe you can look back upon, and that's a real general overview of my philosophies in terms of strength and conditioning for endurance. But we're going to go through a bit more specifics and go through some more recommendations now, probably the stuff that you're here for, really, not these fancy tables. Okay, so if you want to move on, Andy. Cool. So the first tool in our toolbox as a strength and conditioning coach is resistance training. Yeah. Most people probably think strength and conditioning is just resistance training. Okay, it's not. There's many other facets to it, but resistance training is one tool we use, and that may be using, your body weight, band resistance. It might be using machines. It might be using, TRXs and kind of suspension trainers, or it might be lifting weights as well. Whatever we need to get the job done, whatever we need to elicit the adaptations we want in that athlete. Okay. So why resistance train? I did talk a little bit about why I do S&C. So basically, weak things break. I love that quote. It's not my quote, I wish it was. Weak things break, okay? So a weak tissue, a weak tendon, ligament, cannot endure repeated stress as well as a stronger tissue, okay? Simple as that. So just by getting stronger, you can improve your tolerance to that repeated stress, as I discussed in the slide above. And then the other side of why resistance train is improve our force production qualities. Okay, so we want to be able to extend our legs hard into the ground, and then obviously get that return and that propulsion each stride. So the harder we can hit the ground, and if we use that elastic energy, we can bounce, propel ourselves a little bit further each stride. Okay, so that can give us a better kick. And it's also maybe linked to economy from a musculoskeletal perspective as well. So that's why we resistance train. Resistance training is great because we can can manipulate. There's so many exercises, and we can manipulate it so many ways. Train specific muscles, train, specific changes in muscle or tendon or bone, and we can do that quite easily and get the adaptations we want. So that's why it's kind of a big rock in our protocols. So my recommendations for resistance training is build a base through compound movements, and by that I mean multi-joint exercises. So they're as the Americans say, the best bang for your buck exercises, because they have many benefits. And the multi-joint exercises that I suggest are things that involve a triple extension pattern of the hips, knees, and ankles. Okay, as we see in running, as we see in jumping. Okay, so once you've got that in your program, we'll then supplement with some accessory exercises. So I kind of categorize accessory exercises into exercises that condition, made up a new word, that condition tissues susceptible to injury, and tissues that may affect running, running mechanics when fatigued as well. So I think we can all know a few of those kind of things as well. So we do accessories for the little muscles, things like that, on top of these big compound exercises. And most of our athletes, these are athletes from kind of recreational runners, university runners, all the way up to Olympic finalists. We do between 1 and 3 strength training sessions per week. If that time isn't available to you, if you've got and I appreciate you've got to kind of fit in so many other sessions, hill sessions, long runs, tempos, all sorts, track sessions. And, if you haven't got that time in your week, then there's other options of, say, micro dosing, just doing a few exercises here and there and spreading them out in the week, maybe after an easy run, do a little bit of core work or things like that. But I'm going to share some recommendations on that in a while. Okay, so Andy, can you move on to the next slide, please? So the next slide, when it pops up, is my categorization of the compound movements, okay, that involve this triple extension of your hips, knees, and ankles. Okay, so my simple brain, I categorize them into 4, really, 4 main movements. I'm not suggesting you need to do all these 4 movements, but these will feature in my programs at some point in the training cycle. Sometimes all four patterns, maybe in say in the winter, and as we get to kind of pre-season, in season, I might take a few out, whatever that athlete I think they need. So I categorize them into squatting patterns, squatting exercises, variations of, or knee dominant exercises, hinging patterns or hip dominant, stepping or standing on one leg, basically, because that is really important. We do that in running. Every running stride, you're on one leg for a split second. And then split stance exercises or lunging patterns. So if you can remember one thing about your gym-based training program or your strength program, think squat, hinge, step, lunge. Squat, hinge, step, lunge. Try and maybe incorporate at least one of those. So you can maybe ask yourself those questions. There's so many variations of these movement patterns, so many different types of squats, so many different types of lunges and step-ups and things like that. But that's specific to you as an athlete, specific to but yeah, as long as you're kind of ticking those boxes, for me, that's a good start. Okay, so can you go to the next slide, please, Andy? This is really strange, just speaking to a computer screen. So the next slide, here it is, outlines my categorization of accessory exercises. So as I said, we do accessory exercises to condition tissues that are susceptible to fatigue and injury, perhaps. Okay, so in running, the posterior chain muscles, the hamstrings, the glutes, lower back, really, really important muscle groups. The hamstring is probably one of the most important muscles in running. We do kind of categorize it into trunk or torso conditioning, so your core work or abdominal type work. Another area we have real emphasis on is the ankles and feet, the calves, the Achilles complex. Again, an area that is really susceptible to injury in runners. I'm sure if I could see you all, I could ask for a show of hands who's had an Achilles issue or a foot issue, plantar fascia, or a calf strain. I'm sure a big percentage would have that. So that's why we do the accessory work for the ankle and feet. And then the other category is hip robustness. So basically, this is kind of conditioning all the muscles around the hips, mainly the gluteals, the external rotators, the hip abductors, as well as the big, powerful gluteus maximus as well, which is a hip extensor. Okay, so I'm going to share with you some of my recommendations now on some of these accessory exercises. So if you can click to the next one, Andy. So coming up, I need to remember while it's loading, I need to remember which one it is. Which one's coming first? I'm feeling it might be, ankles.
Ankle conditioning is heading your way.
Yes, okay. So again, my simple brain and hopefully simplifying it for you guys to categorize this, tick the boxes. Have you got these in your programs? You may not need them all, but you know, if it's good to consider these variations. So in my programs, I generally have a calf raise variation with a straight leg, with a straight knee. So this is to emphasize the gastrocnemius, which is the muscle on the back of your lower leg. And there's two kind of chicken fillets. It looks a bit like that. So that's the gastrocnemius. So with a straight knee, it puts your gastrocnemius in a more optimal length to contract. Whereas with a bent knee position, like you see the athlete on the left sat down with the weight on a knee, with that slightly bent knee position, the soleus, a muscle, quite a large muscle underneath the gastrocnemius, becomes a little bit more of an optimal length. The gastroc is goes to a little bit of slack when you bend the knee slightly. So the soleus takes over in slightly bent knee positions. And it's important to note that in running, during mid stance, where your center of mass is over your base of support, your foot, you do have a slight flexion in your knee. Okay, it's typically in most people, when you hit the ground, your hips are over your foot. You've got about 30 to 40 degrees of knee bend, so you've got contribution from both the gastroc and the soleus. Okay, so that's important to note. Okay, and then the third variation that I utilize in my programs is isometric or eccentric emphasis variations. Now that if you don't know the technical terms and language, those are contraction types. So an isometric is essentially where you're holding a position or pushing and just your joint angle stays in the same position. An eccentric is where the muscle is contracting but slowly lengthening. Okay, and these give different adaptations. So depending on what the athlete's needs is, if they've maybe had tendon issues or if they have had muscle strain issues, I may be very selective and very specific in the other variation I give them. So this athlete there is standing on their tiptoes and they're walking on their tiptoes. So this is a little drill and she's holding a weight above her head. So that's an exercise which the purpose is to try and increase that muscular tendinous stiffness around her calf Achilles complex. Okay, you can see there, yeah, some well-developed calves there as well. Cool. So I will move on from that, please, Andy, into the next category of accessory exercises. Can you see it on your screen yet?
So we've got posterior chain coming your way.
Perfect. It's come up again. So again, I'm trying to really simplify this for you. So when we're trying to condition the posterior chain, again, I split it into 3, sometimes 4 different categories for runners. Okay, so I think it's easy to remember like this. So we've already talked about hinging at the hip, and that those kind of patterns, training the posterior chain, the hamstrings and glutes. So the picture in the middle, you can see a single leg Romanian deadlift there. So that's a great exercise. So I do generally add a few more hinging patterns into a program, as well as the main lifts. We may do deadlifts and things, but we may also supplement it with something like this. And then the other categories are bridging patterns. So like glute bridges, hip thrusts, those kind of things. They are bridging patterns with a short lever or a bent knee, and that emphasizes the glute muscles, the glute maximus particularly. Whereas if you do a bridge variation with a longer lever, aka like a straighter leg, generally that has a slight more emphasis on the hamstring. It puts the hamstring at a longer length, conditions the hamstrings a little bit more. They're both working. Hopefully, we've got both the glute and the hamstring co-contracting and supporting that hip extension movement. But I just separate some of those movements as well, so I know I'm getting best of both. Okay, so just remember that. Bridging with a long lever, bridging with a short lever, and some extra hinging. Now, the other thing that I sometimes do is some knee flexion movement. Basically, that's where you you bend your knee so your heel comes towards your bum. Okay, so that's an isolation movement for the hamstrings, like a leg curl or Nordic hamstring exercises, if you've ever heard of those. So I sometimes incorporate those, only if we've running into issues and we're not getting enough out of the other exercises, or particularly if we've got faster runners, sprinters and things, we focus on things like that as well. Okay, so yeah, next one please, Andy. So we've gone through the ankles, calf Achilles complex, we've gone through the posterior chain, some general recommendations. The next, I believe, is it the core?
It is.
Okay, so the trunk, the core, whatever you kind of want to call it, yeah? You could consider the core's not a magical muscle just in your stomach. You could consider the core everything from your knees to your neck. You know, the core is everything that controls that midline, stabilizes your spine while your limbs are moving within running. So the way I approach core training for runners is, is more kind of resisting forces or resisting excessive movements that may not be, one, economical. So the three categories I have are transverse plane exercises. So these are exercises resisting excessive rotation. You see, maybe when a runner gets a little bit tired, they start rotating a little bit, and then further down the chain, things start happening that we don't want to happen. That can increase potentially injury risk. So we condition the core musculature to kind of hopefully resist that rotation, so our spine and our torso can be nice and stable while our limbs are doing the work, doing the job. The next category is sagittal plane exercises or anterior core. So this is kind of the front of your abdominals, these kind of trains. You can see some well-developed abdominals on that picture there. So basically, common exercises for anterior core are crunches and sit-ups and things like that. You don't see runners running too much like that. You don't want excessive extension and flexion of the spine while you're running. Okay, so I prefer to do a little bit more of either hip flexion exercises where the athlete there is lifting her knees up, so she's flexing at the hips, but her spine stays nice and neutral, or exercises that emphasize as you extend the legs and the limbs, preventing the ribs flaring up and the lower back arching. So again, that's something that you see in runners when you get tired or got poor mechanics. They may start to stick the bum out a little bit, flare the ribs slightly. That causes issues again down the chain if you into anterior tilt of your pelvis, because you're not keeping that neutral spine and you're arching at that lower back. You can change hamstring length, and there's all sorts of maybe issues with that. And then the third category is frontal plane or lateral kind of core exercises. Basically, that's the muscles almost like down the side of your torso. Okay, So here we're trying to prevent side-to-side movements. Rather than training the side-to-side movements, we kind of do anti-lateral flexion exercises where the athlete here is laying side of a bench. It looks quite magic, but he's actually got something strapped over his feet, which is holding him in place. And if he didn't contract those muscles, he would flop to the side. Okay, so that's a great, it's called a side hold. So that's a great anti-lateral flexion exercise. So they're the 3 categories of core. Now there are some core exercises that kind of do both or train multiple stimulus. You know, they may be an anti-extension exercise combined with an anti-rotation exercise. So I do them as well. They're great bang for your buck exercise too. But they're the categories of exercises. Hopefully, if you understand these 3 categories, you can rack your brains of core exercises you know, and you can throw out the silly ones that you think, oh yeah, I shouldn't be doing all this crunching movement. And you can categorize the exercise you know into these 3 categories here. Make sure you've got a good amount of each in your program. Cool. So the next one, please, Andy. I think this is the 4th group of accessory exercises, which is hip robustness exercises. So you see a little diagram on the side, and that's an anatomy of the hip or the gluteal muscles in the hip. When I've kind of done these workshops and talks before, I often get people to put their hands up and tell me if they've ever been prescribed glute exercises by a physio. So most people have been told by a physio, you've got weak glutes, okay? Now, sometimes I think that's a bit of a cop-out answer. Sometimes it really is, and it's a bit of a running joke sometimes. However, these are really important muscles in running. So chances are you may benefit from conditioning these muscles, okay? Because these muscles in your hip control the orientation of the rest of the leg. You know, they control if your foot is turned in or turned out. They control if it's to the side or inwards, that kind of thing. So, you know, we need these well conditioned. You know, if you see, again, a fatigued runner towards the end of the race, you'll see the hips, knees collapsing in, hips coming out a little bit like that. Okay, so we need to condition these muscles to prevent that. You can see at the side, I've put a few little recommendations there, because I separate these into preparation exercises or resilience exercises. So within warm-ups, you know, my athletes will do, you know, lots of mobility, dynamic activation, running drills, things like that. But they may do some activation work of these little muscles or core muscles, hamstring, things like that as well. So for preparation purposes, I recommend, say, 1 to 2 sets of 6 to 10 reps of all these little glute exercises you can see at the side here. And for resilience purposes, perhaps in a strength and conditioning session, I have to put them at the end, because once you fatigue them, it can affect, you know, other mechanics of other movements. Yeah, for that, I would suggest maybe more 2 to 3 exercises, going slightly closer to fatigue. So you're going between 10 and 20 reps for those exercises. So you can see a selection of examples on the right hand side. But basically, there's hundreds of variations you can do. But basically, we like to emphasize particularly a hip abduction, so lifting your leg out to the side, okay, working the glute medius, glute minimus, and then also external rotation work as well, because that's common in runners to be slightly weak there and coming into internal rotation. And there's lots of little muscles like the piriformis and the gemelli muscles that control external rotation as well. So other musculature that we may condition around the hips is like the hip flexors, but we get a lot of stimulation from the core work as well. And the lower back, that kind of area, we get a lot of stimulation through the compound lifts of there. So I tend to focus on just some of these little accessory movements. Cool. So do you want to go to the next slide, Andy? Right. So that's resistance training done with. I've not got as many slides for some of the other things. As you can probably appreciate, we could do a whole webinar on resistance training. We could do a whole day on it. We could, weeks. We could do a whole webinar on plyometric training. We could do a whole webinar on mobility and things like that. Whole webinar on running drills and technique. And I'm sure there's plenty of stuff, exciting stuff coming up through this series. So the next kind of tool in our training toolbox as an S&C coach is to use plyometrics. Okay, so what are plyometrics? People think, oh, that where you jump about. Yeah, plyometrics. You do a bit of that. Yeah, jumping on boxes, jumping over hurdles, that kind of thing. Yes, that's kind of true. But a true plyometric is an activity that involves a rapid stretch and shorten of the muscle tendon unit. Okay, and for it to be classed as a plyometric, that has to be under 250 milliseconds. That if it's slower than that, some of the mechanisms, so like neural trickery, the nervous system, if it's slower than 250 milliseconds, aka like the ground contact time is slower than that, or the stretch and then the shorten of the tissue is slower, then you're not getting the benefits of that elastic energy. Okay, so it has to be fast, has to be really fast. So running, every running stride is a plyometric. When you're sprinting maximally, you're on the floor for, elite sprinters 0.9 0.1 of a second. So 100 milliseconds, really quick. So massive forces go into the floor and then you ping off the floor really quick. So running is a plyometric. Even slower running, jogging, you generally are on the floor less than that. So it is a plyometric. So why do we need to do plyometrics? Why do we do extra plyometrics? Well, we can manipulate through different variations of plyometrics the ground reaction forces. Okay, so when you're running, depending on how fast you're running, the ground reaction forces, if you was to run over a force plate, are actually really high. Tend to be 3 to 4 times body weight. If you're running pretty quick. But we can manipulate and do plyometric exercises to get even greater ground reaction forces or even quicker ground contact times, and that can elicit some adaptations. And without going into the physiology of the adaptation, basically, if you think of our lower limb, if you look at the diagram in the bottom left corner, if you think about our legs as spring type mechanisms, through plyometrics we can strengthen our springs. We can give ourselves more bounce each stride. We can, a nice economical runner looks really smooth, relaxed, and has really nice, fast, crisp ground contact times, and they just bounce off really elegantly. Whereas someone who's less economical looks a bit more ploddy. Yeah, they haven't got that springs. They haven't got the springs of that elite runner. Okay, so something that is, I wanted to put this up because something it's quite topical at the moment is the technology, the shoe technology, and we've got these fancy shoes that are giving us improvements in performance. Okay, people are spending a lot of money on these fancy shoes, and they are improving performance, which is good if it's in the rules within the sport, but people sometimes neglect their own springs. These shoes, all they're doing to you is they're an ergogenic aid. They're just giving you a little bit more spring in your step, really. They're shaped so that you're forwards slightly. You're utilizing your Achilles quite well. But if you haven't got a good Achilles, strong compliant Achilles tendon, nice springy, bouncy Achilles tendon, you're not going to get as much out of the shoes. So my message really was, I just want to put this up. If the shoes are legal and that's, get the shoes, go for it if you can, but don't forget to improve your own springs. You could put some slippers on an elite runner and they would still beat me even if I had the best shoes on in the world. So there's a message for you. Okay, so next slide, please, Andy. I think this is just some recommendations when it pops up on plyometric training. Yeah, it'll be here in a second. So, plyometric training. I categorize everything to make it simple. I categorize plyometrics into jumps, hops, and bounds. There's so many variations of those three categories, and we can manipulate them in so many different ways. It's important that we only do variations that you are ready for. Plyometrics are stressful. If we are emphasizing, like high ground contact forces and things like that, if you haven't got the tissue strength, there's a risk of injury there. Okay, and remember, you're doing lots of plyometrics in running anyway, so by additionally adding plyometric load on top of that, there's an injury risk. So you've got to be careful. You've got to be really careful, but they are such a powerful stimulus that you'd be silly to overlook them. Okay, so prerequisites are, before you start incorporating, make sure you're stable, make sure you can land, make sure you're not knees wobbling in all over, things like that, and make sure you are reasonably well developed with your strength as well. So you should probably be doing some base of resistance training to complement this. Okay, a good idea when you're considering plyometrics as well is to quantify the stress that you're placing. So in your training diary, write down how many reps and sets you did, write down what plyometric exercise you did, and don't suddenly increase that too much. Again, start really, really light, really gentle, because they have an injury risk. Okay, one principle is extensive to intensive. So extensive means you're not going for maximal power output, you're just doing nice, crisp, maybe 70% effort in the plyos. You maybe do a few higher reps, and then as you progress and you get used to that, you go towards more intensive variations like big bounding exercises or jumping over massive hurdles, things like that. You've got to earn the right to get to those intensive variations. So I can't give loads of recommendations in this webinar. Maybe we'll do it in the future, but just some things to think about when implementing plyometrics with yourself or your athletes. So where do we put plyometrics in our training week? Again, I've told you potentially you need to be doing some resistance training 1 to 3 times a week, or just dosing it in through the training week. Well, plyometrics, I recommend either doing them as a standalone session if you have the time, with say some speed. You may do some strides at the end of that. You may do some running drills during the warm-up. So you kind of ticking a few boxes there, or place them in your resistance training sessions in the gym. So the picture on the right is an athlete doing some, I think it's a single leg drop. She's dropping off one box onto one leg and then bouncing onto a higher box. So we implement them in the gym as well as standalone sessions with our athletes. Or you could simply just microdose them into your warm-up. So just before a track session, you may do your normal warm-up and then just do a few hopping or jumping variations over some little hurdles. And it can be a really good extended warm-up and really prime yourself, get yourself nice and ready for the track session as well. But if you do that multiple times throughout the week, you're getting a good stimulus combined. And then I've just put at the bottom there some recommendations in approximate amount of foot contacts if you're going to quantify that as a beginner, an intermediate, or advanced athlete. Okay, and then some recovery recommendations there. Brilliant. So if you can move to the next slide, please, Andy. We're nearly there. So we're going. Have you got it up, Andy?
Yeah.
Drills. Okay, so this can be seen as another facet or another tool in the toolbox for a strength and conditioning coach, or just for a running coach. At Leeds Beckett with our athletes and at the Talent Hub, we do incorporate drills. We do standalone drill sessions. We do them in warm-ups as well. We maybe incorporate some into gym work as well. So we're trying to promote positive running mechanics whilst also trying to maybe change force production qualities as well. So we feel that has quite a good learning effect as well. So why do drills? There's not a great deal of, say, evidence behind running drills improving performance, but anecdotally, I can definitely say that in our athletes, or even in myself, and when I've learnt drills, they do improve that kinesthetic awareness, your awareness of your body. So while you're running, by practicing drills and then later in running sessions, you'd become more aware of your postures and things like that. And I think that can have a knock-on effect to economy and performance as well. And there are proposed improvements in intermuscular and intramuscular within the muscle coordination. Okay, so smooth, really nice, beautiful, economical runners look relaxed in certain areas of the body. Okay, they're not contracting muscle fibers that don't need to be contracted at that time. They're good at relaxing them when they need, and contracting other muscle groups when they're required as well. So that's a little bit of an overview of that. So my recommendations, again, microdose them into warm-ups, or if you have the time, we do with our runners every Monday night, we do drills and plyometrics as a standalone session, and then some accessory work as well afterwards as well. So yeah, that's my 2 pence on technique drills. But I'm sure we could really go to town on these. Hopefully, I think there's going to be some webinars coming up on these as well. If not, there may already be some. Perfect. Mobility. So I think this is the final little tool in our toolbox that I'm going to talk about. It's a question that I'm often asked. I'm often asked by athletes, or by people, is yoga good for runners and things like that? Do you need to be flexible for runners? So I think we need to clear up the difference between mobility and flexibility and things like that. And I'm going to just share some recommendations. So first of all, the nervous system is complex. Okay, so my suggestion is to prioritize dynamic mobility exercises, and by that, my mobility, I mean taking joints through a full range of motion and doing that regularly. Okay, mobility is probably the physical quality that you can train the most regularly. Okay, so I would recommend putting this before every gym session, even before an easy run, doing some light mobility work, before track session, before plyometric sessions. Take your joints during your warm-up through a full range of motion that's available to you. Okay. Over quite a while now, the last few years, we've known that static stretching, where just holding a stretch and trying to let that muscle relax at its end range of motion, static stretching can impede power output, and it can have a negative impact on that stretch shorten cycle, so that plyometric performance. So it can negatively affect our springs if we do that too close to running. Okay, so I wouldn't suggest holding long static stretches before you run. Now, a lot of people will do that because it feels good. It does feel good, and a lot of people in the industry are saying we should completely ditch static stretching. But through my experience with athletes, athletes like to do it. It feels good, and actually, it is a good way of modulating pain. If you have a little bit of pain, sometimes it's only temporarily, and you maybe need to see a physio and kind of sort things out. But sometimes, at the end of the day, a little bit of a static stretch can feel good in terms of modulating pain. So, that's my 2 pence on that. But prioritize the dynamic mobility. So yeah, yoga. Back to yoga. I like yoga. I like yoga. But what you need to understand there are many different types of yoga. Okay, with different benefits. They will create different adaptations. Some more static holds, some more dynamic, things like that. And also, if you go to a yoga class, that class may not be specifically addressing your issues. You know, if you've got, you know, mobility issues around your hips and you want those addressing, you may go to a yoga class and it may be focusing on shoulders and spine that day. So I think being able to take from yoga and using little elements of it, I think that is probably the best approach. But if you like a bit of yoga and you are a runner, go for it. If you're an elite runner, you can still go for it, but you're probably better off spending time on specific mobility sessions. And just be wary that 90-minute yoga class isn't adding to your fatigue too much. Okay, so that's a little recommendation there. Brilliant. Okay, if you can click the next slide, please, Andy. Coming up. I think we're just rounding off now. So yeah, I wanted to do like a word cloud or something, but I thought this might be quite a good little diagram to show. So basically, to improve your running performance, or to be a robust athlete who can train a lot, and if you can train a lot, you can obviously perform better as well. Obviously, you need a good running program in place. You need the adaptations in the cardiovascular system, you know, heart, lungs, vascular system, the muscle physiology to do the job. You need the engine. You also need the springs. Yeah. So there's no good having a good engine, but not having the springs. Okay. So you might have your cardiovascular system's pumping loads of blood, loads of oxygen to the working muscles, but you've got weak legs that don't propel you too far in running, no matter how hard you try. So focus on that, do some strength training, supplement with some plyometrics, and then use any ergogenic aid you need that is legal in your sport. So go for the good shoes, and that equals gold. So that is my last kind of key message and a bit of an overview for you all. So yeah, thank you very much. I think we've moved to question time, have we, Andy? Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So thank you very much for that. Any questions are welcome. It's a little bit weird. I've just talked for quite a while now on a laptop screen. So yeah, 10 minutes for questions or so. Go for it. People still with us. Plenty of people still with us, which is cool. So, first question. When starting S&C, do you recommend spending time with lighter weights to get the movement right, low weight, high reps, before moving on to heavier weights with fewer reps? Generally, that is a principle that I use. Definitely. I didn't give you any recommendations on set and rep schemes or loading percentages, anything like that. You know, we only had limited time, so I just wanted to give you an overview of kind of the categories of exercises that I suggest that you implement. But definitely, heavy weights are dangerous for one. If you're starting S&C, you know, your muscles and tendons, even bone, you're not ready for high forces from heavy weights. So you've got to earn the right for the heavy weights. Don't be scared of heavy weights though in the long term. You know, after you've been doing some S&C and you've got good technique, maybe you've got a coach that helps you through good technique. Don't be scared of the heavy weights, because you do need tension for some of those adaptations. You need tension on muscles and tendons and tissues to create adaptation. So you need further and further tension on the muscles, particularly tendons. If you want strong, springy tendons, you need lots of tension. They adapt to tension. They don't adapt as well just to light little weights. Okay, thanks for that question. One from Josh Schofield. Hi, Josh. Hope you're good. When looking at the overall program for a runner, with them completing 2 times quality sessions a week, 1 long run plus recovery runs, what is the best way to structure the week to also include S&C training whilst maintaining quality during the athlete's other workouts? Really good question. It's a common question. So yeah, one thing you've got to be mindful of is if you are doing 2 quality sessions a week, maybe track sessions, you're doing a long run and you're doing easy runs in between, you probably haven't got a lot of time. But that is your training load, and if you are tolerating that, that's fantastic. And if you are doing, and if you're not injured and you're performing well on that, that is great. Okay. You've got to be careful then how you add S&C. Don't just throw in plyometric sessions. Don't just throw in weight resistance training sessions and all that jazz. So you've got to be careful with just slowly incorporating these until your body gets used to this additional training load. Now, you can look at one option is to maybe reduce the length of one easy run, and there are depends on the level of athlete as well. There are some studies and papers suggesting that actually sometimes replacing some of the training load with strength and conditioning practices may be beneficial if that's what that athlete needs. Okay, if they've got a fantastic engine but they haven't got the springs, then they may need that. But I don't really like to suggest that. I think running is always the most important thing. Okay, you need to do what you can to kind of get as much running in as possible. So one approach that I have talked about a little bit is micro dosing. So you may be able to microdose some of those accessory exercises after a running session. So if you do an easy run, you get home, do a little bit of core work, 10 minutes, easy run. Another day, get home, do a little bit of calf and ankle conditioning, etc., etc. So I think that's one good approach if you can't fit in standalone S&C sessions. So I hope that answered your question, Josh. Cool. Next one. With current restrictions and not being able to get to the gym, how would you suggest increasing resistance without spending a fortune on weights for the home? Another great question. Okay, so you can, if you don't have any resistance at home, there are ways to get resistance. If you've got a backpack, you can fill bottles of water or get some sandbags and put them in your backpack, something like that. That's a great way of incrementally, challenging your body so that it adapts. You're giving it a great stimulus each time. So that's a great way. One thing that we obviously all need to be doing if we haven't got any resistance is predominantly unilateral work, single leg work. We can't do heavy squats with two legs and things like that at home, really, unless you're going to get a heavy person on your back and squat them, but then you need them to weigh a bit more a few weeks down the line to get stronger. So backpacks, sandbags, water bottles. The other thing is, if you know what you're doing, you can manipulate the leverage. So, for example, I showed a hamstring bridge on a few in the presentations, a long lever bridge. The longer the lever, generally the harder it is. So a hamstring bridge can be manipulated in so many ways. You can make it harder by going on a more level surface, or you can make it easier by elevating your feet. There's so many ways of increasing resistance tension by changing leverage as well. Great question. Chris Hobbs, what S&C recommendations for a young athlete going through a growth spurt? Okay, this is a big question as well. Again, we could do a webinar on physical maturation and long-term athletic development. You just got to be careful. It is a little bit of a misconception that young athletes shouldn't be strength training. But they definitely can. There's lots, there's no solid good evidence saying that we shouldn't. It can actually support their growth and support their strength through this. But we've just got to be mindful of, just pushing them too much. That growth spurt is great. So after that growth spurt, just be patient, and then they will adapt so well to strength and conditioning practices. But maybe that's something we can really talk about another time. Another question, try and get a couple more in. Can I check if all these exercises apply to juniors as well, or any considerations you would suggest in terms of young athletes? Yeah, so similar question. Again, junior athletes, the principles of low load to high load, be careful with that. Everyone's got to earn the right to kind of resistance train with heavier loads. we may just teach, the foundation is technique. We need to teach these the junior athletes technique first before we add external load. So technique, technique, technique. If I get young athletes in the gym, we'll have them squatting just a broomstick, doing things like that. And just, first of all, starting at, controlling their own body weight before we add external load. But the categories of exercises all apply. We still do squatting, hinging, stepping, lunging patterns. We still do posterior chain work, core work, calf work, gluteal work, things like that. Graham Chapman. All great stuff, Dane. Thank you. So far, I haven't seen any upper body stuff. Do you think this is superfluous, marginal for endurance athletes? Okay, upper body work, yeah. I don't particularly prescribe too much upper body work to my athletes. Sometimes I actually leave it up to them, just for muscular balance purposes. If they want to do a little bit, I'll maybe just give them a push and a pull. Simple as that. But I try not to, I don't use too much upper body. I don't want it to kind of add to fatigue, general fatigue. But the way I do approach upper body is sometimes if we can combine some core exercises that use upper body, or we can do some mobility exercises that improve the mobility in the shoulders and the thoracic cage and things like that. If we can do that, we will. But in terms of like resistance training, I don't do too much for the upper body. We want them to have a light upper body as well. Not that it's easy to put on muscle mass as an endurance runner, but we don't want them to be developing big bulky upper body. So good question. Right, looks like that's it for tonight. Helen has spoken. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Hopefully,
thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Thank you. Hope that's been a help, and hopefully I've shared a few kind of my principles, my philosophies on developing an S&C program, and hopefully you've gone away being able to kind of piece one together yourself. Yeah, brilliant.